And our prayer today is from Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine. Hippo is now Annaba, Algeria. Did you know that? North Africa. And when he wrote, and he lived like 396 to 430, when he wrote, he himself in his writings felt he was like a prodigal who had returned. So that's why my mind thought of him. And so this is a very ancient prayer of Augustine that we will pray, of course, translated. Let us pray. You are great, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. Great is your power, and your wisdom is infinite. We would praise you without ceasing. You call us to delight in your praise, for you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until we rest in you. With the Father and the Holy Spirit, all glory, praise, and honor be to you, both now and forevermore. Amen. So last week was Luke 14, I think it was 25 through 33, the cost of discipleship. We talked about, considering the demands of such an undertaking, the actions have consequences, and Jesus also had to count the cost. We talked about the meaning of the word hate in terms of hating family, which we learned is like choosing something over. And we talked about bearing the cross. We talked about renouncing or saying farewell to things like security and life and home and possessions. On one hand, we wondered why religious organizations and leaders present the gospel like making things sound as easy as possible without commitment, but likewise others present it as doom and gloom and not the joy of life transformed. So we left off wondering about all that, and is the sacrifice one that all Christians have to make to the same degree? So that's where we left. Today's parable, I want to ask you, is this anyone's favorite parable? We are in the parable of the prodigal son. That's Luke 15. We're going to start, I think today, there's going to be a lot to talk about. So we'll talk about the other parables if we have time. I don't know that we will, though. We'll start with verse 11. Luke 15, 11 through 32 is this parable. Is it anyone's favorite? It is yours, Dick? Yours too, H? I think it's probably mine too. So between the two of you, you people who like it so well, would you like to read it?
We're talking about that. We need the accompaniment.
I know the song. Yeah. Lead Me Back, the choir sings on those Sundays. You should definitely make that connection.
A certain man had 2 sons. Go for it. Okay. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So the father divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had. He set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in want. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And that young man longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. No one gave him anything.
That brought him to his senses. He said, "All those farmhands working for my father sit down to 3 meals a day, and here I am starving to death. I'm going back to my father. I'll say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son. Take me on as a hired hand.' He got right up and went home to his father. And when he was still a long way off, his father saw him. His heart pounding, he ran out, embraced him, and kissed him. The son started to speak. 'Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned against before you. I don't deserve to be called your son ever again.' But the father wasn't listening. He was calling to the servants, 'Quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then get a grain-fed heifer and roast it. We're going to feast. We're going to have a wonderful time. My son is here, given up for dead and now alive, given up for lost and now found. And they began to have a wonderful time. All this time, his older brother was out in the field. When the day's work was done, he came in. As he approached the house, he heard the music and dancing. Calling over one of the houseboys, he asked what was going on. He told him, your brother came home. Your father has ordered a feast, barbecued beef, because he was home safe and sound. The older brother stalked off, and the angry sulker refused to join him. His father came out and tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. The son said, look how many years I've stayed here serving you, never giving you one moment of grief. But have you ever thrown a party for me and my friends? Then a son of yours who has thrown away your money on whores shows up, and you go all out with a feast. His father said, son, you don't understand. You're with me all the time, and everything that is mine is yours. But this is a wonderful time, and we have to celebrate. This brother of yours was dead, and he's alive. He was lost, and he's found.
Thank you. Thank you both. So there's no question of the day today because we'll have plenty of this to discuss, I think. The heading of this parable. I'm curious how your Bible introduces it. Tell me what it says.
Mine says the lost son.
The parable of the prodigal and his brother.
Mine just says the prodigal son.
Prodigal son.
Mine says the lost son and the dutiful son.
Any others? Any other headings that are different than those? So we have the word lost, which is definitely in the story translated into English. And then we have this word prodigal in some of the headings. Does the word prodigal appear in your story? Not very often anymore, and I'll get to that. But this, I do think, is one of the traditions that affects our interpretation without us realizing it. Other common titles I've seen to make chapter 15 cohere is lost son. So it's lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. I've seen the parable of the loving father. I've seen a man had two sons, just using the first line of the story. So what is the setting of this parable? We started at verse 11, but even if you go back to verse 1 of chapter 15, it kind of seems like it's dropping out of the sky, or at least it feels that way in 11, but in verse 1 gives us a hint about what's going on. It's kind of a continuation. Early in 14, Jesus has been at dinner. Then he was on the road last week, right? He was telling the parable of the cost of discipleship on the way. And now, what do you think? Where is he? Yeah, it seems like it's a farm setting. We know tax collectors and sinners are listening, right? We know Pharisees and scribes are grumbling. Inside, outside, public, private, it seems like kind of some of each is possible. And this is like just kind of tucked in here. So Jesus, who do you think Jesus is directly talking to? Last week it was a large crowd. Do you think it's the same this week?
Yes.
Which seems, these are very emotional parables. It seems interesting. I would, every time we read this parable on Sunday morning, read it during Lent, even in here today, because this is one that I think people connect with so much. I don't know if you noticed this, but you get emotional when you read it and you get emotional when you hear it. It gets very quiet whenever we hear this story. Have you noticed that? So who are the characters in the parable itself? List them.
Father and two sons.
Father and two sons. So are they all three main characters, or is there just one main character?
Yeah, either the father or the son. I don't know.
I think they're all
Brother.
main characters.
Yeah.
We-
Maybe the brother.
We get dialogue from all of them, don't we? It's such an interesting story that way. It's so developed. So I asked that question. I mean, you don't have to, there's no right answer, but I just love to know your reasons for the answer. If you think there's one main character or three. And I asked too, because the way we've titled this in history, the prodigal son, we kind of think it's like about one person, but you can see so clearly that it's not actually just about one person. So what is the surprise or shock or scandal in the story? I'm asking you some of the same questions over and over again, because I want us to kind of be thinking about parables similarly, at least to start with. So maybe there's more than one surprise or shock or scandal in this story. Like I said, it's very well developed. What do you think?
Well, it's not a shock to me anymore because I've heard the reason.
Right.
But one of the shocks to me, and it wasn't that long ago that I heard this, but the younger son, I want my property. I want what belongs to me. That is usually not even given until after the dad dies.
Right.
So essentially, he's saying, Dad, I wish you were dead so I can have my money now.
Yeah, right.
That to me was a big surprise.
And it certainly would have been to the first listeners, right? That's that the story starts with a scandal,
Yes.
right? Instead of just to what might be for us, if it was a superficial reading, if we didn't know that fact, we would just think it's a random detail to start the story. But it starts with an insult, basically. Good point. Are there good shocks in this story? Good surprises too? Not just negative ones?
Well, that his father is so kind to him.
His
so
father is so kind to
his
him.
Father takes him back. He
Yeah.
doesn't scold him, or he sees it as a good thing that he's home. Well, then he was waiting for him.
Yeah.
Father spoiled it.
He did.
Why did he give it to him in the first place?
Said, just think over and work like your brother.
Exactly.
You know, that happens a lot. The younger kids are spoiled, the older kids have
But you know what, if in today's world, if somebody is going to,
Signed it. So has everybody signed it?
Hmm.
Where does this go next?
I don't know. Did everybody sign the card for Nelson Bonnie? Okay, up to you if you want to, otherwise we'll just cover it. Yeah, I'm gonna make it little. Go ahead. You,
if a person leaves a foreign country now, say, a lot of times their family will give them something to take care of them to get started in the new country. Okay, so this son is going to a new country. So his father gives him this stuff to get him started in the new country. But he's an immigrant. And so when he goes into that country, there's famine. And when there's famine, they're gonna treat their own country people first. So he wasn't able to get the riches and the food and the stuff that the other people in the country did. And so that's why he had to go home, because he was starving and they wouldn't help him.
It doesn't sound like he was interested in the first place in working. He was wasting it on, what did you say, horse?
I was hoping this would be this way. I love this so much. Good. Okay, so this draws on family dynamics. I think we all can relate to, right? So much so, like I said, I have a hard time reading this myself on Sunday morning when it comes up for Sunday Lent. Like, it's so emotional, emotions everywhere. It's familiar. It is significant that this parable doesn't begin with or. So it's not necessarily like a third version of the parables preceding it. It's more like a lengthening or an extension or like a pinnacle, right? I say that too, because the first two stories, Lost Coin, Lost Sheep, call for a celebration, but the celebration doesn't happen. This last story is an actual celebration. And I also want you to notice in the story who's not present. We never hear about a mom. We never hear about sisters. The paradigm might feel familiar though. And I found this very funny. Last night, one of my kids said, what are you teaching about? What are you going to talk about Bible study, Mom? And I said, well, we're going to talk about the parable of the prodigal son. Do you know that parable? And I'm thinking, please God, know this parable.
Yeah.
Because your name is Luke. And your name is Luke because this is the best short story ever written. Please know this. And he's like, I think I know that story. Is that the one? Is it like Isaac and Ishmael? I'm like, no. But he's exactly, his little rudimentary understanding is exactly right, because brothers as rivals are all over the Old Testament. So it is familiar and would have been familiar to Jesus' hearers because there are stories like that. Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, sibling rivalry as like a pattern is clear, right? This parable also doesn't begin with like a familiar and which one of you. Do you notice that too? What's missing there? He doesn't say that. It's just a story. So it's a very unique story. And another unique thing about this story is how much dialogue we get. Okay. If you notice, a lot of our narrative is descriptive narrative about people that we don't hear talk. Every once in a while, we'll, like when we read one of the parables, we got a little bit of the internal dialogue of the guy with the barns, right? But in general, we hear descriptions. But here we have so many speeches. The younger son gets, we get his request, we get his like internal dialogue, we get his confession. That's just for starters. Then the dad speaks. Then the younger son speaks both to the servant or older son, both to the servant and to his dad. And it's all verbalized. So the father's speeches are climactic too. There's the part 1 and a part 2 to what he says. And like I said, the elder son has 2 dialogues with the servant and then with his father, never with his brother, which I think is significant also. Okay, so let's kind of walk through some of the text. We won't be able to get to all of it because it's like 22 verses or 21 verses. Verse 11. What Kay was mentioning is absolutely right. The demand for an inheritance. The New Interpreter's Bible, which is like one of the big scholarly Bibles I read and check out, called this disrespectful and irregular. He is breaking his family ties. Whether it was for a good reason or for greed, it's disrespectful and irregular. And the verbiage is that the father divides his life, his bios, between them. Okay. If you have the apocryphal book of Sirach in your Bible, you might be able to look this up because that actually, there's a line in there that warns against early inheritance. So is the dad a pushover? I think Pastor Dick thinks so. What do you think?
He was already an unusual dad because in that day you would only give to your oldest son.
The oldest son definitely gets more. The younger, like I think.
No, it doesn't say that, but in this Bible, it says the oldest son gets most, it's more. Say all.
Yes, most. And then I believe, if I remember right, it's half to the older son. And then depending on how many other sons you had, they split the rest.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
So.
Dividing it while you're still alive.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got it. How can you give away half your farm if you're still?
Yeah. And now you're making yourself dependent, right? So, okay, we'll leave that question. Is the dad a pushover? Or is he naive or what? Maybe all of that. Verse 13, I have dissolute living. Squandering his property in dissolute living. Verse 13, what do you have?
Reckless living.
Reckless,
Debauchery.
wild, debauchery, ooh, good,
Undisciplined.
undisciplined. Wasted. Oh, I love it. So it's an adverb, asotos. It means prodigal. So this is where that word, so we've kept the title and we lose with the translation, we made the word different. So 50 or 100 years ago, it would have said prodigal living. Prodigal means loose or riotous or wasteful because of bad choices. So many of you, if you remember English class prefixes and suffixes, a can mean without, or it's a negative. Asotos is very similar to and related to sosos, which is like the word for salvation or health. It's like without a care. It means incorrigible. Okay. And this word is used in the New Testament, but the only time it's used as an adverb to describe the type of living is right here. This is a very unique story grammatically too. The noun form of debauchery, like debauched living, is used about 3 times in the New Testament. We read, this is the one that whenever the reader gets it, I know they think, oh no, I don't want to read this. It's Ephesians 5, where it has that big list of things that you shouldn't be: drunkenness, licentiousness, right? All that stuff. It's in there. Titus 1, it's in there with, and I think it's translated as rebelliousness. And then 1 Peter 4 is also a list of vices, and it's in there too. So do you think it makes a difference titling the parable on the actions of the son, not on the other characters or their characteristics? I think it does too. I mean, it definitely makes you focus on that thing, right? What do the rest of you think?
Yeah, because if they titled it The Loving Father, you would almost have, you might come across with a different feel for the story. Or the angry brother.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like a matter of emphasis, right? Or where your brain wants to have grooves and like hang things on things. And so, this is why I've always been asking, what's your title? What's the heading say? Because I really do think on at least a subliminal, these titles can be very suggestive, right? For how we interpret.
It's a series of stories about lost things.
Mm-hmm.
And a lost sheep, sheep, you can eat one of them. Coin, a coin, but this is a person.
A human being.
This is the big
Yes.
story.
This is the big story. Yep. I can't agree with you more. So what I love about this is it isn't, so we've been studying parables that go lesser to greater, right? And what I think is so cool about chapter 15 of Luke is that all of those things are present, the lesser to greater, but they're not explicit. They're just that way. And it just like, pow, right there. I think that's cool. So rabbis specifically prohibited raising swine. Okay. Sorry, farmers who raise pigs. Quote from the ancient sources: none may breed swine anywhere, I read, and cursed be the man who would breed swine, and cursed be the man who would teach his son Grecian wisdom. It was the same curse, they said. I love that. I think it's hilarious. So the rabbis fought Greek wisdom or Gnosticism just as much as the early Christians did. So verse 17, I think, was where you stopped it and H picked up. You had that brought him to his senses. I think you had in verse 17. Yours is, I know, done by paragraph, so it's hard to know actual verses. H, but it's something like that, brought him to his senses.
That's what it says.
And I had, he came to himself. He came to himself. What do you all have? Verse 17. Came to his senses. Have a great day. Anything else? Came to himself, came to his senses? Must be. Okay. What's that mean?
He had an inner dialogue with himself, saying to himself, what am I doing?
Yeah. Does it remind you of the rich fool and his inner thoughts? Remember when he was like, self, I have many goods for many years, that kind of thing. Remember him? We heard his inner thoughts too. The word is came, And it's the Greek word that means come or go or arrive or growth. And then there's a reflexive pronoun there. So it's himself, herself, itself, however you want to, whatever the word before it is, it's the reflexive pronoun for that. So I don't know. I find that to be an extraordinarily psychologically sophisticated idea for that time. That you would come to yourself or come to your senses. In ancient Palestine, it was undignified, unbecoming, shameful to run.
What?
To run. Rich men would never run. For a couple reasons. Like I said, it's undignified. Another reason is if you run, you would be showing your ankle. Because, when you run, you have to have clothing that's higher that, you literally wouldn't be able to do it. And so that too is shameful. And you would never. So there are other stories, echoes in the Old Testament of similar things. Genesis 33. Esau runs to his brother, Jacob. You remember that story? But this too would certainly be an uncommon detail that we would miss unless we knew the context. So what are we learning about this dad?
He's unconventional in more than one way.
Yes. So verse 21, he's got this confession all worked out, the younger brother. And the dad interrupts him. He doesn't get it all out. Do you think that's significant? This is like verse 21. Remember, he was going to say, I'm no longer worthy to be your son, just treat me like one of the hired slaves. He doesn't even get that part.
Nothing what you were gonna say matters. It doesn't matter. You're home.
You're home. You're here, right? The action is more important than the word or the proper recitation of the words. So there's a ring and a robe. What's significant about that?
He's not under son again.
And there's public recognition.
What?
There's now it's public recognition, right? You are officially received back into the household. Verse 24, we've got two contrasts. What are they? Yeah, dead and alive, lost and found. And they echo later too. Are those the same thing?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Lost and found could be an inanimate object, dead and alive.
Yeah.
There's life.
Yeah. There's possibility to be
Yes.
found.
Mhm.
So Jesus is playing with categories that are supposed to be static, like dead and alive.
Especially in alive.
Right.
Lost, sometimes you can find,
Right.
but dead is dead.
Dead is permanent.
Unless you're Jesus.
And these two things come up again later in the story. So that's why I wanted to ask if you feel like they're the same thing, different. Okay, so verses 25 through 32 is the second act, where the elder son is introduced for the first time. Before verse 25, we didn't even know there was an elder son. I mean, we did, but we didn't know about him, right? He was just anonymous. So how is the elder son described?
Angry.
Verse 28, angry. Do you have other words? Everybody has angry. Nobody has anything else. A different word than angry. I'm trying to remember what Eugene Peterson says about the older brother. Does it say he became angry?
He says he's angry and he refused to join in.
Okay. So the word is orgize. It's like to be angry or exasperated or irritated or wrathful or indignant. It's all of those words. And it comes from a word that means to like teem or swell up. So I don't think they knew about blood pressure, but I think maybe they did, right? And the parallelism continues. So do you notice the father goes out to meet the elder son too? And he is not addressed as father, but he begins his remarks to the elder with what? Son. Right? So this guy is on the side of relationships, apparently, right? Verse 27, I'm kind of going back, I have safe and sound for how he describes the brother, the slave, I mean. What do you have in verse 27 for what the slave says? Or the house person, or however you said it was described.
Mine is just, he has come back home.
He's come back home.
Mine says coming back home unharmed.
Unharmed,
He's home safe and sound.
safe and sound, yeah. It's the same Greek word that we get the English word hygiene. Hygieno is the word. It means like in good working order or healthy, right? Sound, condition, in balance, all of those possibilities would be what it is. And then, like I said, there's a dialogue. He answers his father, listen, here's what you didn't do for me. But with the son of yours, he won't even call him his brother, when the son of yours comes back. Then the father says, son, right there, he's addressing him in the personal way. You are always with me. All that is mine is yours. Is that true?
Except for the portion that the younger son.
Which he would have gotten anyway.
Yeah. Well, I guess.
Is that fair?
Say more.
When he's fully back as a son, he's got the ring and he could leave again.
You sound like an elder brother.
I know both sides.
Yeah.
You have to look at, like the son that was left at home all those years. Hate was building in him. And you look at all three of them, the father at that particular time was always sort of wanting the dead to come back to life.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that's the son that was, that came back, he's sitting there scheming. So you can look from all things. The only trouble is we don't have the rest of the story.
Right.
Like, what's that guy's name?
Paul Harvey,
Yeah.
right?
They leave you hanging on all three, so you can argue forever on what's right and what's wrong, but it doesn't matter in a sense, because you're gonna be in the same position someday, one way or the other, and you got your heirs looking at you, he's getting old, it's a never ending story.
So that brings up a question for me, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but I'm curious for you, Denny. Does the open-endedness make it frustrating for you or exciting? Because this is kind of
You can
the parable of parables.
You can kind of have feelings for all three individuals,
Yeah.
in a sense, like Father said, you're in the story because your own life intertwines with what's happening there. And fathers do tend to favor certain people in their families. And to the one who isn't the favored one, it leaves you always hanging. The only difference was in my family, there was nothing to gain from, financially or any other way. But it still hurt throughout your life because you were not the favorite. And that goes for girls and the guys in the families.
So the open-endedness allows us to interject
Yeah,
feelings,
argue forever.
our feelings
Yeah,
from
argue.
our experiences into this story.
Yep. Sure do.
And we're throwing stuff in there that isn't in there.
Maybe we care about, and maybe if we're a sheep farmer, we really care when there's a lost sheep, we might shed a tear or a coin, right? But I don't think so. It doesn't, we read those earlier stories, I think people go, that's nice. This one though, ooh, we're just locked in. So I want to get to one verse really quick and then we'll go through some of the things that you're bringing up because I do think that's so real. So the last verb or word I want to show you is in verse 32. The last thing the father says, verse 32, but we had to celebrate is what mine says, but we had to celebrate. What do you got? Had to, it is right to. My phone is somebody's phone. Okay, it is right to. Ideo is the word. It is necessary, it is fitting, it is a necessity. It's the same word when the New Testament says the Son of Man must be killed and on the third day rise. So is celebration also a divine necessity?
When something this good happens.
Yeah, it's when the dead comes back and is found again.
Yeah. And not everybody's so happy about it though.
Yeah.
So I mentioned this before, but notice the father's speech uses the term brother of yours, not son of mine, which is how he phrases it. So in the logic of the parable to the father, right, you cannot be a son without accepting being a brother. And then those lost and found and dead alive categories are used again. So Charles Dickens says this is the finest short story ever written. I agree. I really agree. And this is before short story was even officially invented, right? By like the 1800s. So in these, like, what is it, 21 verses or so? Here's what we get. I made a list. Adolescent rebellion, alienation from family, the appeal of the new and the foreign, the consequences of foolish choices, the warmth of home remembered, the experience of self-awareness and repentance, the joy of reunion, the power of forgiveness, the dynamics of brotherly love, which leads one to depart and one to be indignant. Contrast between relationships based on merit and those based on steadfast or faithful love. What do you think that no penance seems to be required of this son?
We don't know that.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Well,
Against
father
it.
did that.
From the father, right? You're right. There might have been social costs to be paid, right? For the rest of his life. I know what you're saying, but not to get the ring in the road. It was just to show up. He didn't even get to say really sorry.
But there was penance on the jury home. And that was his penance.
Hmm.
Making that journey and coming to realize, why I really did waste all the opportunities. And sorrow for
Yeah.
that.
And the sorrow includes the relational piece. You know, what he says is I've sinned against heaven and before you. So, I mean, there is a spiritual, I would say a spiritual awareness, so to speak, as much as there could be one. Do you think he received his punishment already? By his squandering?
I think there was some suffering.
Suffering. Mhm.
I don't think the elder son felt it was enough.
Right. Okay, I find this so interesting as I keep seeing ads for this documentary about the royal family that's coming out. A man had 2 sons. I'm like, do we not do this all? I mean, and we've set up, there's an entire kingdom that's set up to make sure there's sibling rivalry. Think about it.
Okay, and Abel.
Yes,
Aaron Spare.
Aaron a Spare. What, isn't that the name of his book? Spare or something? Isn't it? Whew, all right. So, yeah. So what do you think the moral, well, let me put it a different way. I guess I have a couple more questions. What does the elder represent? What perspective does the elder son represent?
It's us, isn't it? I mean,
And what is it? What is it?
Well, I mean, the people that sort of try to do everything right in their lives and don't, go off and squander all
Yeah.
their money.
Merit-based thinking.
Yeah.
No elder son would have done what that young kid did. They haven't made,
No.
they always behave.
Yeah, they do.
what was the relationship between those 2 boys before? Because I want that older son to be happy to see his brother.
Right.
And instead he's taking it out on his dad. His
Yeah,
dad is
and
the
he is not happy.
bad dude.
He is not. So is the moral of the story clear? And if you think so, what is it?
Well, traditionally, it's the generosity of the father.
The father is utterly merciful and
Yeah.
generous and loving.
And we have a whole host of reactions to that.
Yeah.
Depending on if we are in need or if we are not.
But, okay,
Yes, I love it. This is my dream when we did parables, that we would,
there had to have been issues going on that younger son was not happy at home and felt his only recourse was to get the heck out of there. So what was the relationship between his father and him before? Or between him and his brother? Did he feel that it was so bad and he was treated so poorly that he had to leave and he asked for assistance to get out of there? And then it's just like some of these kids going off to college that have been overprotected and they get out and they splurge and they do all of these horrible things. And then they realize that, mom and dad aren't gonna pay for college anymore. And so now they've got to fess up and they've got to come home. How is this really much different than some of these situations like that?
it's lived 1,000 different ways every day, isn't it? The story?
We don't know. I mean, there's been times when I would love to run away from some of my family members too.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, there's nobody to give me the money to go to school.
You make a good point though about self-identity or independence, which would not have been rewarded in that culture. I'm not sure it's rewarded in ours. We love independence so long as we don't make, but self-reliance is sort of a myth, right? I mean, none of us can really go it alone.
And it's
Fully.
always all about that oldest child. They never did anything wrong. I mean, as the youngest child in the family, you've got a lot to live up to because everybody expects you to be just like that older one. You get the same grades as they do. They get that, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on that youngest one.
And he didn't want to be a farmer.
He didn't want that.
Yeah.
It's just like the cartoon, Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer. That little guy wanted to be a dentist, and you can't be a dentist and an elf.
That's right. You had to change your station. Yes. true. But I love that you're but I think that's really important. There's no way to separate our own emotional lens when we interpret not just this story, but I would say this is a great example where we can see it at play because we're so right there. But there are other stories too. And depending on our life experience, the lens through which we interpret scripture, which, I mean, so this brings a point to me, like, what is the moral of the story? Why does Jesus tell parables at all, if not to do this exact thing, so that people actually care?
Well, and my part about the immigrants, that was an article I read in the Gather magazine that we used for our Bible study for Circle. And that was a whole thing in there about how he went to this foreign country and wasn't accepted.
Yeah, they weren't going to roll out the red carpet for him, for sure.
No, he was not accepted. And he squandered his money. There was a famine, but they didn't give him any food. I mean, he was out on his own. And it's kind of like, we have immigrants come here. Do we treat them as one of us?
And what are they really doing with the benefits?
Really? Yeah,
Really?
What do they do to, how are they getting those benefits?
Right.
What are they coming up with? How much are they selling on the side? Or
It's
whatever?
good points. It's good points. Jean, you had something you want to share.
Well, I just, you think of the father as a divine father, and you put yourself in either the older brother or the younger brother, and you hope that if you were the younger brother, that our father would be just as forgiving and accepting. That's what I get from the moral of the story. And I think of it as a play, like a script in a play. The lead characters and the antagonistic, and the hallmark ending,
And it's well, yes and no. It's all in 21 verses,
yes.
which is, I think, incredible, the amount of detail that gets tucked in here. It's astonishing. Really, it's so concise. Okay, so we have 9 minutes, 8 minutes. The parable leaves us on a cliffhanger. Did the elder son go in? Did the elder son go in? It's left on the porch between dad and elder.
No.
He didn't go in. Not the first day.
Yeah, not Cindy.
No, he's still out there stewing.
Die mad about it. Okay, what do the rest of you think?
He needs to read the story. After a while, when he gets older and has his own children and really begins to understand love, he'll read this story and then he'll maybe understand it.
Yeah.
Because we read this when we were kids, but it's a different story today.
And we'd flatten it, right, for kids. So it'd be like, there was a bad one and there was a good one. And dad loves them both, bad and good. But you have to repent, right? I mean, we would make it like this moralistic thing. But I hope you can see there's a ton of ambiguity in this story.
None of that matters to me. It's a story about understanding God. All the parables are given to us to try to understand God and his relationship to us. I'm sorry, that's where I'm at.
Right. And there's this relational piece that's all throughout. There's a temptation, certainly from the younger brother, for whatever reason, right? Whether it's good things he's going toward or, things he wants to run away from. We don't really know. But there is this, the temptation the younger son faces, but there's also a temptation in the parent and the sibling to make this separation reciprocal forever, I think. Because the first son's separation is temporary. But the others could be forever.
He doesn't know how he's going to be received.
Right. He doesn't. The best he can hope for is to be treated like a hired hand, right? That is his hope.
But he doesn't know it's temporary.
Correct. And there would be no reason to assume that it would be. anything other than, he's trying to make a bargain is what he's trying to do.
He's hungry.
He's hungry.
Yeah.
And I think
hungry.
the older brother went in, because if you put a lot of action or
Mhm.
emphasis on the word son, you were always with me. And I picture him holding him by the shoulders.
Yeah.
All
Pushing
that's
him in?
mine is yours. Yeah. All that's mine is yours.
Yeah.
That would have some very emotional.
Does that not beg that question? I think that we've been talking about that, when you make that leap to divine love, that would be God's will, that everybody works it out so they can get along, so they can, because if we have to celebrate, if there's a divine necessity to celebrate, would not God want all brothers and sisters to be able to be reconciled?
So maybe that's the moral of the story, is that as parents, we want our children to get along. So God wants all
Isn't that the prayer of your heart if you're a parent?
to get along in the world, instead of fight each other and be jealous of each other and say, you got more than I did, all that.
I've only been a parent for 16 and a half years, but I mean, is that not the prayer of a parent, that the children get along? I mean, I certainly know that was, but when my mom died suddenly, I remember thinking that, and because there's all these questions of, money, whatever. And then, there's just style differences. One sister thinks this, one, and I just remember thinking, all mom would want is that we get along. So it really doesn't matter what we do, because I know all mom would want is that we get along, right? I mean, I just knew that reflexively.
I have a twin sister also. And for one birthday, she gave me a t-shirt, and it said, am I the good sister or the bad sister? Yeah.
Is she the good?
Yeah, she was.
This is this too is a cliffhanger.
And this was a gift?
This was a gift. It's a picture.
You sure about that?
Yeah. And it was from the show video.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting in the middle, and then my youngest sister and my twin sister, they're grinning.
Oh, boy.
So
Yeah.
Rembrandt, was it Rembrandt who?
Yes, there's a beautiful painting of the story of the prodigal. Rembrandt, yes. In fact, Henry Nouwen, who is now deceased, but he wrote a beautiful book, meditation on the Rembrandt painting on the prodigal son. This is a story that has captured the imagination of the church forever, I think, really.
It's one of the things that puzzles me, that Mark and Matthew don't have this parable.
I know, it's unique.
They didn't put it into their.
No.
It's only in this gospel.
How could they have missed it? I mean, it has obviously stuck with the church for 2,000 years. But either they didn't feel it was important enough, or their audience wouldn't understand it, or why. This is the most important parable Jesus tells, as far as I'm concerned. And why don't they have it?
Were they single child, or were they?
They were only children, perhaps?
Children, and so they didn't have that rivalry between
That
siblings.
could be, maybe
But
so.
even as a kid, this is when you remember,
Yeah.
you know,
Sure,
this,
yeah.
you can forget that.
Well, I can totally, I mean, I'm painting with a very broad brush. But Mark is short and sweet and immediate. So long stories, I mean, he didn't do that. Okay, that's not his jam. As an editor, he'd go, kick that one out. It's extraneous. Matthew, I think it teaches, because there's not enough repentance in this story and teaching. It's too relational, too much feeling. So I could see where he would also be like, yeah, it's extra. We don't really, it's not the heart of what I'm trying to say. The heart of what we're trying to say here is that, there's the kingdom and the separation of sheep and goats and, all that stuff. You better be on the right side. Luke is an interesting gospel in the way that the stories are of people on the margins. There's a ton of song and celebration in the Gospel of Luke. If you think about, this is the one we read at Christmas time, you know, we've got this, the Magnificat of Mary's only in Luke. We have honestly, the story of Elizabeth and her song, and Zechariah, they're only in Luke. The story of Simeon and Anna in the temple, they're only in Luke. So, you know, you're talking about the Broadway play Wicked. The first two chapters of Luke's Gospel are a Broadway play, basically opera. I mean, there is song. And then these parables are done in these interesting ways too. Kind of annoying sometimes if you're, again, looking, because Luke will be the one that will add a detail that kind of throws the ending. And you go, but wait a minute. So like even parables of growth, there'll be one way in Matthew, one way in Mark, and you think, okay, this makes sense to me. And then you read Luke and it's like, okay, but that gives it a different spin. Now it says something else. You know, he would do that. And he many times had stories of people on the margins more. He really did. So it is interesting that it is unique to him, I think. Other comments? Anything from our Zoom crew? I don't think so. Okay. So we're going to leave it on a cliffhanger. And with our feelings, we're going to have to stay in our feelings. Okay. And then next week, we could have some feelings about this one too. We'll be in the parable of the shrewd manager, Luke 16. Then we're going to move to Matthew for a few parables of like kingdom, like judgment-y stuff. So here's my thoughts. Next week is December 14th. The week after that is December 21st. Then I think we take a break, right? We often do, and that's when programming here is not in the evening. So it's really, it's nice for us too, as, for staff, but also for me, if we don't meet December 28th and January 4th. Okay. So that would be our 2-week Christmas break. So we'll meet through the 21st, take a break. Okay. And then come back January, whatever that is, 11th. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Diane. Thanks for being here.